Okay, so welcome to our discussion about React. It's your second day working in, or second module working in React, and I was just about to share what the breakdown is going to look like and how we're going to run the next couple of days. So if you notice here, it's a 2-day. React 1 and 2 are both 2-day modules. Okay, what does that mean in terms of like Lambda School speak? Well, each one of these points here. If you look at user interfaces, responsive design, web tools and frameworks, these are all sprints. They last a whole week. A sprint is made up of multiple modules. If you notice, the first few weeks, we had 4 modules or so per week, so we started a new concept each day. Whereas with React, for example, we only have 2 modules, which means we get 4 days to cover 2 modules and to take things principle by principle and dive deeper into each principle as we move forward. So the principles we're going to be taught, and so we have React 1 and React 2 for React week, and then we have a React 2 week, which should probably be called like Advanced React or Foundational React or something, where we talk about routing and Ajax, which you're going to learn about next week. So that was a little bit of a confusion for some of you. We're like, we're starting on React 2 module, but yeah, it's the React 2 module that lives within the React singular React week, okay? So think of this week as like exposure to the week at large, okay? So today what we're going to be learning about is to understand the concept of the component lifecycle inside of a React component, and then a couple of major commonly used lifecycle methods. One you already know and have seen, and then another one is very commonly used for fetching and retrieving data, etc. So we're going to be following along, and I've been updating this last night, late at night, and then this morning before class today. So there's going to be some changes to this as usual, and I'm going to try and just continue to add as much content about what we go over into Training Kit, as we go. That's kind of my MO, is to, continuously teach you and prepare, even though the content we have had prepared, that Sean and I prepared, and Ivan has tweaked, and, a lot of us have worked on over the last few months. It's just not currently in Training Kit as you would expect it to be. In fact, if I refresh the page, you'll see that some things just barely got changed. So yeah, working on that as we move along. So that's enough of disclaimer, housekeeping items, just a breakdown of how we're going. The projects that you work on today, React 2 Mini and React 2 projects, they will carry over from today and tomorrow. In fact, tomorrow you can take the project as far as you'd like. It's really fun, and it's a really fun, cool project. And there's a lot of stretch problems there for those of you who get sort of the MVP or the minimum viable product done early. Okay, so let's talk about React. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can pull up a whiteboard for you, so we can just conceptually talk about like what's going on with React at a very high level. Can you guys see my fun little whiteboard? I'm going to draw a big smiley face for y'all. Okay, great. I love this. Okay, cool. Let me clear that. And I have my Slack open on my other monitor today, so feel free to continue to reach out with questions as you so commonly do. Okay? Oh, you did not see the smiley face. Can you see me drawing on the screen right now? No. Okay, let me try again. Let me stop sharing. And if the whiteboard doesn't work, what I'll do is I'll just draw on my, can you guys see it now? There it is. Okay. I wonder if it has to be on this screen. What if I move it over here and I continue to draw? Thanks. Okay, you guys can't see me drawing there. Let me clear everything. Can you see me drawing? Negative. Okay, so it has to be on this screen. So I'm going to swap things. Okay, moving things around. I think it has to be on my main screen. That's a problem with Zoom. Okay. Alrighty, no mouth face. We'll just do a little smirk. Cool. Big chin, lots of hair. Okay, cool. We'll get out of here. All right, it's fun. Okay, so React. What we have is this beautiful library that's built in JavaScript. by the Facebook team, right? You guys have already gone over this, so this is just going to be a conceptual overview of some things, okay? So let's consider this in terms of like building a web application. We have a web page, right? So on our web page, we're going to have some content. Maybe we'll have a couple buttons. We'll have like a navigation header up here, some call to action down here. And each one of these things on our web page, if we have like our navigation, this is a terrible wireframe, so please, no harsh judgments. Okay, so this would be our call to action, CTA. You guys learned all about that from Josh. Okay, this would be like a button, right? So a user could click here. We want the user to click here. We have some sort of functionality, and that's what we're going to be doing in React. We're going to be building this functionality out. We're not only going to be rendering the specific HTML and CSS that makes this thing lay out right and look beautiful. We're also, inside of our components, we're going to be adding the logic to make our JavaScript do what it needs to do in order to provide that interactivity. Can you guys now see my screen? You guys can see my little picture that I'm drawing, by the way? Just to checking in. Okay, great. Okay, so this is nothing new. You guys have seen this. You guys have seen something like this. You haven't seen this beautiful rendering of my drawing, but we have this ability to create this beautiful this web page. And what React allows us to do is sort of unopinionatedly, so without opinions, build reusable components that we can use throughout our application, or build small portions of UI that make up our entire user interface, right? So each component can be thought of as a singular piece of user interface, as a singular piece of UI that we can use to get something on the screen and to allow our users to interact with our web pages. It allows us to build, compose our applications is commonly used. That term composability is all what React is about. Being able to, take a small piece of functionality and multiple smaller pieces of functionality, combine them together, and utilize those to build our application. So this header up here would be a component, and each individual nav button could potentially be a component in and of itself if you wanted it to be, or it could just live inside of that. Some other call to action or some hero banner here that's like a big H1 tag like welcome, right? That could be a component, and this call to action button, maybe this CTA button could be a component as well that is reusable, that you use in multiple parts of your application, that renders a different color based on a prop that you give it or something like that. So that's kind of the idea here. But what's interesting about React is everything that gets set in that render method, which is a LifeCycle method, by the way, render, will actually be returned. That's what gets returned to out of your code into what's called the virtual DOM, which is where the React engine looks at it and says, hey, this is going to be turned into all of this JSX looking stuff, this HTML looking JavaScript with the div tags and everything. That's going to be turned into this, right? So this is where we have a compiler that takes our code and turns it into the DOM tree, all right? But every single component has what's called a lifecycle attached to it, okay? And the whole pre-class video and the article that I linked on will allow you to dive deeper into the subject, which you can pick apart over lunch and learn more about all of the lifecycle methods. Will explain that the lifecycle methods actually get called at different times within the context of the virtual DOM. So our component gets mounted, and then we have a process. And the process eventually will turn into the render function. So that is the major portion of every single React component, is render out some sort of DOM element or some sort of Boolean or an array of DOM elements or something, right? And so turn all of this code into what can exist on the screen is essentially what React is doing. But yes, there is a life cycle in which our component will be built up and then will be destroyed or taken off of the screen. Okay, and there are methods that we can tap into, and you can find those methods. Let me stop sharing and then share again in just a second. You can find those specific methods at React, in the React documentation. Sorry, I had the link pulled up and then I switched all my browsers together. So state and lifecycle React. So if you look at this article, and I'm sharing my screen right now. Cool. If you look at this particular portion of the React documentation, it's where it's going to explain how things get built up and then how things get taken down in the context of the React UI. Thank you, Michael. That's perfect. I was just barely going to link that, but that's why I have project managers to help me out with this stuff. Okay, so render is the first thing that I want to talk about because it is the method that we're going to see all the time when we're building a React component. So yeah, let's take a look at how this all works, and let's build some stuff within Code Sandbox. And you guys aren't going to follow along with me quite yet. This is just me talking through some of our processes. So I'm just going to pull this out, give us a clean space to work with on that screen, and then I can get my tools set up. You can tell I have not been teaching for a week because all of my stuff is not where it normally is. And that's fine. It just takes a minute to get set up sometimes. Okay. Cool, so Code Sandbox is one of my very, very favorite tools. Essentially what it is just a React sandbox. Like we can build React applications. You could build a full-fledged React application right here in the Code Sandbox with zero configuration, zero installs. It's awesome. And if you open up your new window, this is kind of how I like to work with it because it gives us a little bit more usability with this little window. And then I always just take this, like our preview, and just get rid of it. Just add it to the side, get it off the screen. Okay, so what we have here, just at the default Code Sandbox, is just a very simple stateless component. What do I mean by stateless component? Can anyone tell me that? What does it mean to say that this component is stateless or functional? It doesn't have a class. That's one way to interpret it. Yeah, there's no state object that it's concerned with. You can have state if you don't have a function, if you're using the class keyword, it is very common to see the use of component state. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute, and extending the React component, okay? But you can also have state inside of a functional component, but this is a stateless component, meaning there is no state object that it's concerned with. We don't care about any state. All we care about is turning this hello tag, which is a component, into, sorry, let me move this down a little, into this DOM element here. Okay, and then turning this h2 tag into this DOM element here. That's all we care about with the default Code Sandbox components, okay, that come out of it. So, but that's great and all, but what if we want to tap into the React lifecycle, and what are the benefits of doing so? So the React lifecycle is something we use when thinking in React, and you're gonna hear that phrase a lot throughout a lot of documentation. I think it was Pete Hunt from the Facebook team who originally gave a conference talk at like a JavaScript conference, who talked about rethinking best practices and thinking in React. So you'll see that in the documentation and tutorials and things all the time. How do we think in terms of React? How do we think in the React brain, right? And so the context here is that we have, like I talked about earlier, the composability, but we also have that life cycle. We think about our application being built as a combination of multiple smaller components, just singular pieces of UI. Think about components as potential reusable pieces of UI as well, right? In React land, a component is registered using the React component class, and because we import the component in from the React library, we get a lot of helpful methods that are built into the API from React itself. So unfortunately, with this default component here, we don't have access quite yet to the React lifecycle at this point, okay? So we have to import in the major class component from React to be able to do this. And where that comes from is from React itself. If we pull in component, which is just another piece of the React library, then we can use that component and extend it as a parent class for all of our children, okay? And anytime we want to tap into the lifecycle methods, we need to extend component. So now we're going to take app, and we're going to refactor it to use and extend our component, okay? So you guys don't, once again, you don't need to follow along. This is just me giving you an example, and then we're going to move into a code along in just a minute. So class app extends component is very commonly seen, and you ought to get used to that syntax for everything, okay? Now we have a bunch of stuff that's broken in our application. In fact, if we went over here and refreshed the page, you'd see that we probably have a bunch of console errors, which we do fail to execute post-message DOM window. Doesn't know what to do with this stuff. And the reason is because we're not returning anything out of this class from our very special lifecycle method, which I've hinted at what it's called today. Does anyone know which one I'm missing? Which lifecycle method? The render method. Okay, everything inside of a component class needs to be returned out of a render method. Okay? All right, no more errors. Let's go and refresh my page and let's see. It doesn't like, maybe it's gonna give me some issues with some stuffs. So let me see, there's no more problems. Maybe the window, maybe we have to close that and try and refresh our window. There we go. Okay. So there are going to be problems as I pull it out to the side, but we'll see if we can mitigate those as we continue to use. It's not a perfect application, but it's still the best out there for playing around with React components. The question came up, what about super? We're extending component, we need to call super, right? Well, we don't have any default data for this component yet, which is where our constructor function would be called, okay? We're just simply extending this now, and then super needs to be called when we're setting up the default or the this stuff, like state, inside of our constructor function. Let's do that now, okay? So this right here would be where we put our constructor. And if this were a child component, or if this was a component that receives props from another component, then we would pass our options or our props in here to our constructor. But now you're right, as we build our constructor and we're going to set our default properties of this object on our constructor, then yes, we need to call super. Yep. So this is where we would then set what? If we wanted to concern ourselves with some specific component data, what's the object we want to set here? This dot state, and it's just a plain empty object. Okay, you guys are ahead of the curve as far as what you need to know. This is good stuff. So we build state as an object that we can use within our functions, within our components. Okay. So let's build something that's going to render a bunch of items to the screen and play around with it. First things first, I'm going to actually delete this. I don't need that hello.js anymore. And we're going to get a bunch of nasty errors saying, hey, we're trying to import something that doesn't exist. And now we're going to get a nasty error that says, hey, you're trying to render something that doesn't exist. So great. Let's save that. And let's look at React app. Okay, so great. It's still rendering what we're looking for. And we're going to render a bunch of Star Wars characters. So I'm actually going to say, may the force be with you. All right. So what happened here? Not very much. It's not a great application. It's just really presenting a H2 element, right? Inside of a div tag. It's not that great is what I'm saying at. Stay go ahead. Okay. Cool. So this is just rendering this H2 tag, right? But in the process, this code, this JSX, was delivered. So think back to that beautiful crude example that I was drawing on the whiteboard just a few minutes ago. This div element will get sent to the virtual DOM, and JavaScript's or React's compiler will analyze it and say everything's good to go. And then the reconciler of the React engine will take it and say this needs to be turned into a DOM element. Okay, this looks like HTML to us, but it's not. Does anyone know what this stuff is right here? what this div is and what this h2 is? Yeah, it's called JSX. So when React was first announced, everyone just like lost their brains. They could not fathom the idea of going back to this XML land where we're like writing these tags together and using these composabilities. But it took like all of, a good 2 hours of everyone playing around with React to say, yes, this is a good idea. And there's a lot of reasons for that I won't go into right now. I recommend that, and maybe if you guys poke me and remind me, I'll link you to an article or a talk by Pete Hunt that describes why this is a good idea. Okay, so awesome. Inside of our constructor, we have this state object that we can then consume within our entire component here. So app knows about state, and we can access state anywhere we want. So if I were to set some property on state like name and say Ryan, and we're gonna move this around and make it more dynamic in just a minute, and then rendered, this .state.name, but inside of curly braces, right? As is the React way. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. You notice that we just see Ryan on the screen. Awesome, we're rendering the data that's here by calling this .state. So I'm wired up, my component works, I have state on my component. Okay? Pretty straightforward stuff.
Hey, Ryan, your mic doesn't work.
Can you guys hear me now? You guys good? Okay, sorry about that. I muted myself so I could cough. I probably coughed right into the mic. Okay, let me go back. Let's go back a few steps. Okay, so our application here, Ryan, being rendered to the screen in an H2 tag is not very useful, just because it's a string, a singular string of data. Okay, now let's actually make this an array of Star Wars characters that we want to render to the screen. So to do that, I'm actually just going to call this Star Wars cars, whatever. You'll notice that I use Star Wars in a lot of my examples and a lot of your practice and toy problems and things. So I'm going to grab this list of Star Wars characters. It's going to look very similar to, this component should look very similar to your to-do list where you just had an array of to-dos and you rendered those to-dos to the screen. Now this is going to break everything when I try to just render an array because it's not going to know, oh, it's actually, whoa, that's new. That came with React 16. It had to have because we're not looping over this data. That is fantastic. Okay, cool, new stuff going on here. By the way, React, one of the best reasons to get into React is, and I'm going to borrow this phrase from Tyler McGinnis, with React, you future-proof your career because it's a library that's going to be around for a very long time, that is constantly iterated over, that gets new updates all of the time. And because of that, we get the latest and greatest technologies almost monthly out of React. So with React 16, with React 15.0 and below, or 15.9 or whatever and below, you were not able to render an array of strings to the DOM like this. This didn't really work out that way. This is actually stringifying it and adding it to the DOM and probably just turning it all into a join or something. So that's fun. That's fun that you get the chance to do that, but that's not dynamic, right? We have an array of just set characters. Right. Cool. I'll talk about that in just a second, Edward. So yeah, normally you would pass props through here if this was a child component, but Star Wars character is going to be a parent component. It's going to be a component that holds state and passes that state down to a child component. Okay. So this is good and all. We have this fixed list of data that let's loop over and let's actually turn into DOM elements, because right now you're going to see it's just a long string of data that just looks like this. It's just bunch of put together joined strings. Cool. With no rhyme or reason. It's just text, right? It's nothing great. There's no DOM element about it. But let's change this back to the phrase, may the force be with you. Cool. And then let's actually loop over this data and return it into like an unordered list of sorts. Okay. So unordered list, you guys know this stuff. And how do we actually iterate over this data? What is the JavaScript array method that we use in React to return out a new object to the DOM? We map, right? Map is why would map be good here? Does anyone want to take a stab at that? Why would map be something that we want to use here? Yeah, in this case, it's not actually returning a new array. We don't need it to return a new array. So it would return a new array if we set it like const my new array of cars. This would then, and then we did this.state.map or whatever. Not the use case for right now. We're not trying to build a new array. We're just trying to return out what? Each div, each individual element, right? So each car will be returned to the DOM, and we could just do an implicit return here and say, print out the car inside of a div. Well, we want to do it like this. If we're going to achieve this on one line, we'll just say each character char will be returned. So this is an implicit return here, okay? Right, a fat arrow function, and the character, so each item in this array is a character. And if we look, not quite there yet. Let's see, this.state.char, maybe I had to save. Hey, there they are. Yeah, we probably should, since we're inside of a, you're right, I'm sorry. This should be an li, good call. So then it'll be bulleted and it'll be a list element. And if we actually added a couple more styles, we could get rid of those stupid bullet points. But it's okay. This should have, since I was doing this in a UL, I should have been rendering an li. Okay? So yes. So this map will return this particular string or the item found at this string. Okay, or found at this index. So index 1 is going to be char, Luke is going to become char. Create and return this object. This will become an object in the virtual DOM, which will then be a DOM node after the virtual DOM reconciles everything. Okay, so that's sort of the life cycle, the process here. But this component is being built up, and anything that we use out of render will be returned to the DOM, right? You probably have run into this error, this warning message saying, warning, each child in array or iterator should have a unique key prop. Okay? In this case, our unique key can be put, because we're rendering a bunch of elements over and over and over again and returning a new object to the DOM each time we render, or each time we map, we're just giving this a bunch of DOM elements and then reconciling it through the virtual DOM. We need to give basically a key to React. React needs this key because this list element is dynamic. It has no clue what it is. So this is fixed and it's not dynamic, it's static. This div is also static. There's not an unknown number of elements that are going to be rendered through a map function. So since we're mapping over a list and returning an unknown number of elements, we need to provide it with a key. And I'm just going to use car plus, and then I can grab the index off of our iterator. Whoops. And to do that, I have to add parentheses and then define our index. So now, if I were to reload the page, I probably ought to save that. Let's see what happens here. You'll see there's no more errors, and if I inspect this and look at what gets built onto the DOM, this normally comes with, and you can't really see it because I think it's because of Code Sandbox, normally comes with what React would say is like a way to interpolate or look at this particular thing, okay? Not a huge deal that it's not there right now, but you used to see a bunch of tags in React land, but you don't see those inside of Code Sandbox because I guess they're abstracting it away or hiding it away. So not a big deal. If I were to just do index, React would know about that, and there are inherent problems. Okay. Somebody asked, Noah asked, why can't we use for each? It looks like a lot of people, yep, so Scissor answered that perfectly. For each doesn't return anything. We need to, and we're implicitly returning it here, return an element to the DOM. Okay, so because of that, we need to use something like map. So good question there. That's great. Awesome. So yeah, I'm using index and character here because there are implicit issues with using just the index. If you guys built your to-do list and you were using just the index as the key, and then you were filtering out the deleted to-dos by that key, then you added another to-do by the length of the array or the index, and that's the key that's associated with it, then you may have two DOM elements with the same key, and React is going to throw up on you. It's going to blow up an error. Okay? It cannot. So if I just showed you that real quick and I just tried to use the same index for every single item, React is going to throw a fit. Encounter two children with the same key. Okay? So that's why I'm just making it a little bit more unique by combining not only the index, but combining not just the index, but combining it with the character string itself. All right. Okay, so this is good and all, but sometimes our data doesn't really do this. It's in a perfect world, we would just be building static websites, right? But how good are static websites today? They're not very good because all of our data is usually stored in a database somewhere on the server. We go and fetch that data and give it to our component or our web application. So because of that, we have a dynamic data. Very, very rarely will you see static data like this. Okay? So because of that, we need to look and rethink our component just a little bit. So I'm going to delete this data, and we're going to tap into another LifeCycle method that's used very commonly for this very purpose. And the LifeCycle method we're going to be looking at is called component did mount. Okay? So, okay, we'll move. Yeah, cool. Another thing to note, just real quick as a side note, with our render method, is we now have, with the advent of React 16, the ability to render sibling elements. Okay, so we can actually return an array of elements, and that's why we saw, once I was trying to render out those elements, we saw that that each string was just getting printed to the screen. So to demonstrate that, I can give this an array. It's going to break everything for a minute until I figure it out. And let's just say that I have a name here that's going to be a div that's going to be rendered every single time. And we're just going to say name. So it does, oh yeah, I need a comma. It doesn't like that comma. Okay, so this would be the syntax for the new React 16 compiler, which can now render and return sibling DOM elements. So if you saw this, maybe, I wonder if it does not like what I'm doing here in this case. No, there's an implicit return there. This, let's see. No, this should work. I wonder if I actually did an explicit return, because that's the only difference between my code inside of Code Sandbox and my code here. And then just fix that. Or if it's a problem again with Code Sandbox. Oh no, duh. Do you guys know my problem? You guys might know my problem. What am I doing? Why am I being boneheaded? Tell me what's going wrong with this right here. Yeah, my characters array was deleted. So if I put my data back, so I'm such a bonehead, thank you. So we'll just do Luke and Leia for testing purposes. Okay, so there we go, name and Luke and name and Leia. So that's one other thing that you can return from your render method, okay? so we're returning something that, calls for a return, and you could do this at this level as well. You could return two sibling divs, et cetera, or two sibling elements. So that's a huge deal. We've made it to like this amazing place where we don't have to wrap everything in a div, and we used to get in our React application this thing called div bloat, where we wanted sibling elements, but we had to wrap them in a div to return a singular DOM element to the page. Now we get the ability to return multiple elements as siblings. Okay, this was not kosher a few months ago. Okay, to give it an array of elements that you want returned. Okay, so that's really cool. So that's one thing you can return now out of your render function. That was worth mentioning, and it's inside of training kit. So I wanted to make sure you saw that before I moved on to component did mount. So now let's move into component did mount, chat about its use cases, and figure out why it's important to us. Okay. This method gets called as soon as the virtual DOM has confirmed what is going on and what is going to be returned from the render method. So remember, our render method is going to just be presenting the elements to the page. Okay. And the virtual DOM is going to take that and say, what is all the data that these elements are concerned with? What is car and index? What are we mapping over? What is this .state.cars.map? And that's all going to be taken care of there inside of that context. And the render method is going to be just looping it over. And it should always just be pure. The render method should always just be returning some sort of DOM element or something that we can interact with or something that our component needs, right? But if our data does not exist like this in this format, and we need to call for it in an external resource somewhere, then we need to use another lifecycle method to be able to ensure that that data is available to us by the time this code or this DOM element is mounting to the screen. So it's very rare that our component will ever hold its own data long term, meaning there won't be very many instances where when building a component, you want hard-coded data living inside of your state object, okay? This is how web apps are built today. We consume data in our front-end projects, our front-end applications from external web servers across a technology called HTTP, which you're going to be learning all about next week. The good news about component did mount, which is our method that we're going to be tapping into right now, is that we have the ability to actually call set state from within inside of the method. Okay, and set state, who remembers what set state does with us? And while you're does for us, what does set state do for us? Edward asked, the one question that has been bugging me is when accessing local storage, is that the only method to do it, or you can access it another way? Really been on my mind since yesterday. Okay, so you're talking about using component did mount inside of session storage, right? Just to be clear there. Okay, yes. So that is the go-to method for something like that. Component did mount is the go-to method, and we're going to talk about that right now. And yes, set state actually updates our state. It takes what we originally had on state and returns a new and improved copy in an immutable way, meaning we don't have any side effects. We just take our old state and then we return a new copy of state every single time set state is called. Who knows what happens in the life cycle, and this is a stretch question, what happens within the life cycle when set state is called? What happens to our component? Yes, set state is asynchronous. Robert, that's beautiful. It is recreated. So what is recreated? Well, our component is recreated, but how is it recreated? What function would need to be called in order to recreate? Yes, when we call set state, render is then called again, okay? And then instantaneously, we have a reactive response. So when we set state, it goes and re-renders what is actually going to be reconciled to the DOM, okay? So that's the beautiful idea of component did mount, is that you can call set state from within it. If we wanted to access something in a permanent location like local storage, or more permanent than our component state, and we tried to use something like component will mount will actually be called before the render method gets called the first time. So render gets called and is important for mounting our DOM elements. So there is a very good chance that you may have a mismatch. Data that you're expecting to be there from within component will mount that you're trying to set on state, state doesn't exist there yet, or potentially it doesn't exist at the time that that data lives. So that's why we do it inside of component did mount, because it is the lifecycle method that will actually be called shortly after we have something to work with in our DOM, and then so after our render is called, and then we can call set state, which will then simply recall render, which will then return our DOM elements. Now let's see what that looks like. Okay, so going away from hard-coded data, we're going to leave a default array in here. Why would I want to leave a default array in here? Who knows? That's a very stretched question. Yeah, so the data type is known, so map works, so that we can actually loop over this, because render will be called when this component gets built. But however, characters does not live yet, right? And so if we don't have this defined and we're trying to map over it, it's going to say cannot read property map of undefined or whatever, cannot map over something that's not there, right? And so because of that, we want to default it. And we used to use something called get initial state inside of our component lifecycle methods. But now we just use a constructor, because the constructor is very, very good at setting up our default properties or our default objects that we need to be concerned with. Okay, enough said, enough said. Let's move into component did mount. That's not syntax, that's a typo. That asterisk there. Okay, so component did mount will be called shortly after the first time render is called. And then we can call this .set state from within it. Okay, so if we had our Star Wars characters, whoops, that's dumb. Not inside of an object here. Okay. I want to stay. I didn't mean to navigate. It's probably my mouse. And we added those Star Wars characters to our list here. Normally, this data would just live elsewhere, but right now, for demonstration purposes, I'm trying to show you how to use component did mount to render this stuff up. Okay? We can then call this .set state, which then takes an object or a callback function. More on the callback function later. But the object can just be the representation of your new state. So anything that you pass in here will update. Everything else will simply be ignored and go back to the default. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I had something like title up here and added my title as a string, hard-coded, maybe you want a dynamic title, and this is just for test purposes. Title will be, just simply, returned out. So set state will get called. Characters are going to be set with these characters, but title is not going to be reset. It's just going to be simply copied over and ignored, right? It's going to be added as its original. Okay, so if I now render out title here instead of that hard-coded string, then we're going to be pulling it off of state, and then you're going to see after component did mount, and let's actually do some console logging here. Let's just do that. And then let's do some console logging here, and let's do console.log render called, here is state. Okay, this is going to demonstrate kind of what I'm getting at within the lifecycle conversation here. Okay, let's go over to our screen here, and if you look, we still are achieving the same principle. We're looping over our data, only we don't have a hard-coded array on our state. We're dynamically setting it later on. Okay, so let's look at our console and let's see what's going on here. And let's render our screen. We don't have our unique array. Okay, cool. Okay, so check it out. Render was called. Here is state, title, empty characters. Pretty straightforward there, right? We all see that this is our default state. When render was called the first time, it rendered this very object right here, as it was. Characters, empty array, title is may the force be with you, exclamation point. Then component did mount was called, and let's see what happens with render. Render was called again. Why was render called again? What did we call that forced render to be called? Set state. So we have our characters now set on our array, and we have the title the same. It just simply copied it back over. And I'm going to get rid of that warning. I don't know why this warning exists when our key should be that. Oh, it's because of this. It's because of this. We're rendering names so many times. So, oh man, what do I want to do here? I could just do the character. This needs an array, or this needs a key. In this case, I'm never really super concerned. In fact, let's just get rid of that. It's ugly anyway. Let's get rid of that bogus stuff. And let's just return, instead of an array of elements, let's just return the list item. Cool. All right. Got rid of the warning. Refresh the page. Yeah, I could have just used the index. Okay. So this is the beautiful thing right here. Notice that we have called component did mount. And within component did mount, just like Zach mentioned, we called set state. And and yes, Kevin, I'm going to go over that right now. I'll recap this whole thing. So render gets called, and originally we have our set state, or our original state that's defaulted, okay? And then component did mount gets called, and then render gets called again, because within inside of component did mount, we actually called set state. Component did mount comes from the React API. It's built into React API, and we can use it when we're extending the component class, okay? It's part of what is called the LifeCycle methods. So going back to this article that Michael linked above, you can see that there are a bunch of lifecycle methods that we can tap into and learn about that come from React component, okay? We're using this syntax here in the documentation. It looks a little different from mine because they're just simply not importing it like I am and referencing the object directly by saying react.component. So it's the same thing. You'll see syntax all the time, like this. Somebody has a hot mic. I'm going to try and mute everyone real quick. That's not as easy as it sounds when you're in screen sharing mode. Cool, muted. All right, unless you have a very burning question. Okay, curious. However everyone's feeling about this, go ahead and so if you look at your participants panel, go ahead and give me either a raise hand if you're on Linux, I guess, or a yes check mark if you're feeling good about component did mount and render so far, and you're ready to press forward into our code along exercise. And if you're not, it's okay. Make it known though. Just click on no, or indicate to me that we need to. Okay. Awesome. So we got window. So I want to make sure that everyone is clear on this. Component did mount comes from React component. Okay. Component that we're extending is the React class, and it is going to be called, just like in this example here, it is going to be called after our render method is called the first time. So render method and component did mount both come from React. So this is just a good recap. Render will get called. It's going to concern itself with this data, and it's going to concern itself with the default data that's right here. Okay? And then shortly after render gets called, if component did mount lives in our code, if we have defined it and declared it inside of our component, React knows that this is a special keyword for it. So we can say component did mount, do this stuff. It's going to get called shortly after render method gets called the first time. This is the setup of a React component within the lifecycle. This is the building of that React component. Shortly after component did mount gets called, we are setting state, which is going to then force a render to be called again with our new data. because we have new data set on state. We get this render method called again, and our data lives there for us to be able to use and consume. So Sagdi asks if we can show us a use case for component will mount. Unfortunately, component will mount does not have very good use cases because we have the constructor function now. Component will mount is very good for like a default setting on the overarching parent component of our application. If we need some like default API key set for our component to use, that's when you would use component will mount, but you'd use it at the very, very top level and set that stuff and keep it in your component state there. There's a very heavy controversy going on right now, a discussion on whether or not component will mount will be removed in the near future. I don't think it's going away, but its use cases are very far and few between, which is why I don't want to go over it for you guys, because it's more important for you to know component did mount and render. Very minimal use cases for component will unmount, although one of the most commonly used use cases for will unmount is destroying some event listener that you add to your component when it's mounted. So if you had, and I could go into detail on that for days, but yes, component did mount would set up your event listeners. If you had special like click events or hover events or resize events on your DOM, and then will unmount will then destroy those as your component leaves the screen. Okay. The React docs are seriously some of the best docs. Yes, that's very true. So in our stretch problem local storage, we need to use component did mount. Yep, that's exactly what I would use. That stretch problem would have forced you to really, really research into implementations of how to get data into your component. Okay, we're taking a 5-minute break. I guess we'll call it a 7-minute break. AD, thank you. Go ahead and go use the restroom. I'm going to stop recording right here. Welcome back from our break. Just started recording again, so thanks for bearing with me. But yeah, there's a really cool tool that I want everyone to get right away. Okay, so as soon as you possibly can, go and check out this tool called the React Dev Tools from Chrome. It also exists in Firefox as well. So if you go to the Chrome Web Store, find this developer tools extension and add it to your Chrome. Okay, yeah, nice, Matthew, that's perfect. Okay, so I'll give everyone just a little bit of time to do that because you're going to be kind of concentrating on that. And then as well as time to pull open this code sandbox and follow along. Okay? So the data, and while you're doing that, it's fine. This will be recorded, so I'm just going to talk. So if you're still concentrating on getting that stuff installed, work through it. That's great. And in just a second, I'll ask where everyone's at. So the data that we're going to be working with for this application is the same data that we built and played around with a couple weeks ago when we were learning about map and reduce and filter. So this data should look a little bit familiar to you. Okay, so that cities.js file should live inside your application. And then the cities list and index.js are other files as well that should be inside your application. Okay. Now inside of Zoom, will you give me a yes if you have the Chrome DevTools installed? Once we hit about 45 installs, we'll forge ahead. Thanks, Jared. Need about 10 more installs and we'll forge ahead. And then if you haven't gotten it installed, we don't have a ton of time. It shouldn't take too long. Just find the Google or the Chrome DevTools for React and add it to Chrome. And then you might need to restart your Chrome browser once that's the case. Okay. Cool. All right, gang. So what this does is it actually allows us to inspect our element. Chrome DevTools for React are built to look inside of the innards of a React application. And there's some cool things that you can configure and play around with out of the bat. So if you look, you can choose a theme, so you're not just looking at dark on white. So you could go solarize dark, you could go tomorrow, you could do tomorrow night, you could do material. I just like material. It's pretty common, pretty straightforward. So yeah, I highly recommend playing around with theme colors. That's not super great or super important, but it is, especially if you're you want a consistent coloring. Okay. So if you notice, if you see what we have here, we have our JSX React elements that we built, our app component, and then our cities list component, which live inside of our application. So let's look at cities list. Let's look at app. App is what type of function is our app function, or what type of component is our app component? It's a class component, right? Okay. And how do we know it's a class component? It's pretty straightforward, right? It's right here on line 5. It's a class. Is it stateful or is it stateless? Stateful, right? We have state. Okay, this is beautiful. You guys are fabulous. And so you can see how powerful already the React Chrome DevTools can be for you when building a React application. If I were to look at the state of my application, I could see that I have an empty array of cities. So right here in the right column, once I inspect element and click on the React tab, I can inspect this is also, I clicked on this little thing that comes with Code Sandbox, and I clicked on open in new window. So I highly recommend you doing that because their little window, their little browser is kind of finicky sometimes, especially when you're debugging and you're looking at things like this. So this is what's super cool about React DevTools is you have the ability to dive into your application and see how it's all laid out in a virtual DOM setting. So you notice it's just hello from cities list. And that's what we're getting right here on the cities list component. And notice from cities list, we're console logging the props object. Okay? So props, if we look at our console, it's just an empty object. Nothing on it but the prototype that comes with all objects. Okay? So pretty straightforward there. We don't have any data to share yet with cities list. That lives inside of cities.js. So what we're going to do is we're going to refactor this component to be able to consume our cities data. So like with everything we do, and this is you following along with me now, on line 4, write import cities from cities. And that's going to pull in this object right here that we're exporting using module.exports. So this object then is going to be named cities, and it's going to have a property of data on that object. So right out of the gate, if I were to go back over to my index.js file and within my constructor even, probably after I call super, console.log our cities, you're going to see in the console data. So I'll go back and I'll show you where I did that. On line 9, so I'd imported cities from cities. Okay? And on line 9, I console logged it in after I called super. Okay? I don't know. Zoom windows, is it zooming in and out like that? Sometimes I double click on my mouse. Or maybe you're double clicking on a mouse that can react? I'm not sure. Interesting. Yeah, if anyone else is having issues, let me know because I'll make sure they get resolved as we move along. And hopefully the recording looks good enough, right? Okay, so very straightforward there. We now, inside of this component, know that cities can be used and utilized within our component. So what we're going to do is on line 14 and now 13, let's use a lifecycle method to consume that data. The lifecycle method we want to use is component did mount. Pretending that we're using this in a way that's going to get some external resource from somewhere and render it to the screen, okay? There you go. All right, so now we can consume our cities data and we can set it on state. And so when we render it, and then once we set it on state, we're gonna pass it down to cities, okay? So this is the process here. So I'm gonna say const, and I'm gonna just grab data off of cities, okay? And then for now, we'll just console.log data, and then we'll call this .set state, and we'll say cities equals data. And I am going to also do that thing where we'll say, well, what I'll do is I'll say this.state.cities, and I'm going to say CDM check-in. And then inside of render, I'll console.log render called we're about to get to props right now. Props is a very specific keyword for React that actually symbolizes the properties that are going to be passed down from one object to another. Okay? Sorry. Good stuff. All right, so now if I actually refresh the page, failed to execute post message. Let's see. It's that lame error that keeps happening. Story of my life. There we go. Render was called, array is 0. This is being called from within cities. So this is from down in cities. CDM check-in, array still 0. We call set state, render called, our array is 4. And then our props get set again. So check this out. This is actually pretty interesting to look at, and we're going to get to this in 1 second. But this is really cool here, what happened. Render was called, props was called within our cities list, okay? So render was called. Let me move this out of the way. Render was called. Then within cities list, look what was called right after. Props. Let's show you that. Props from cities list. Okay, save that. Let's see if we get our little. Awesome. Render called empty array. Props was called, right? So we try and render our next component, and then it's saying, hey, console.log props, nothing in that object, but it's still there because we've defined it. And because we've defined it as props, React knows what to do with that. Then component did mount, checks in, it gets called, and then our set state gets called, and then we do the same process. Render called, we now have data, and then we still have an empty object because we haven't passed anything down as props. Yes. This is a very good question, Edward. You asked about this particular line right here. This is saying that cities itself is an object that has a property data on it. Okay? And it's saying create a variable called data from that property on that object. It's called object destructuring. And if you just wanted a new object of all the properties, you could just say, cities, and you'd create a brand new object as if you're using, object.assign. So you're welcome. Okay, so please, if you're not here yet, click on the no X in Zoom. So if you don't have this printing out in your console in some way or another, go ahead and click no. And we'll make sure that you have time to get there. This is the follow along, so I want to make sure everyone's there. Great. You can raise your hand or something, Liz. But thanks for checking in. If you don't have the option that I'm asking for, you could just simply raise your hand or give me whatever option that you have. Okay. All right. So there's a good chunk of us who are not quite there yet. So let's just make sure that you guys have an access to this screen, and you can see. And then as you are done, and you actually got to this point, make sure that you call or that you disable your no. You can clear it or whatever. Okay. So remember, inside of component did mount, we're importing in our cities, and then we're setting a variable called data equal to the data property on cities, and setting that on our state right here. And then we're just simply console logging these logs so that we can check in and kind of see how our component is working and what's going on with it. There is definitely a code sandbox console. If it's not showing in your Chrome console, that's fine. Yes, thank you for bringing that up. The console, I believe it's down here in the footer. Yeah, so check this out. This is really, really cool. So this is a newer feature, so I'm not quite like used to using it yet with Code Sandbox. Maybe it's not new and I just haven't seen it yet. But yes, inside of console, you'd be able to see, if I were to type $R, doesn't know about it. That's the React object that points to whatever component you're setting it to. But yeah, inside of console, you'd be able to see those very things. So if I were to refresh this, it acts the same way. So render was called, props from cities list is still an empty object, CDM checking in, CDM is getting called, and we're looking at cities, and it's not set with the new data yet. So CDM checks in, we have an empty array still. Render called, this time our array is actually set, and cities list is still an empty object on the props. So the other thing to log here is console.log inside of cities list. Make sure you're console.logging a title saying, hey, this is from cities list. Yes, exactly, Robert. So Robert said, just to be clear, props is an object passed into each component that contains the properties, right? Yep. So you can't see that, but when you use a custom component like welcome name equals Sarah, what's happening is an object is being passed into the welcome component, which you refer to as props, with the name property set to Sarah. You are understanding absolutely correctly. That is exactly how it works. So if I wanted to pass my cities to cities list, what do I want to do here? Well, I have to define a property on that props object. And how I do that is I add it to our JSX element the same way that you would add an attribute to a DOM element. Okay? So if I say cities and set that equal to this.state.cities, now let's save that and let's see what happens as our screen mounts. Ooh, check it out. So originally, we had just an empty object on our check or cities list component. That empty object was just, there was nothing defined there. So render is called here, then render gets called here, okay? And we're logging out the props. So what's cool about our props object now? This is props from cities list. What's cool about it? It's set to the default cities array, right? Now, let's check in with CDM, set the state, then render gets called again. We have our cities, and then render gets called again from within cities list, it's like we're calling render again here because we're concerned with React. There is no render here happening with the render itself, with the lifecycle method, but this is just a function that's returning some stuff. Okay, it's just a vanilla JavaScript function that takes in a parameter that's going to be an object. And by default, because this is within the React space, we can just say that that object is the props object, right? That props object will receive properties that we define here. Cities.js, I haven't changed a thing, so it should be completely the way it was when you navigated here in the first place. So this is what it should look like. It's just a city data. But what you need to do is make sure that you import it in on line 4 like so. And what I'll do is I will actually just snip this over so that at this point you can make sure that you can, so that should be everything for cities list or for index.js, and then inside cities list we haven't changed anything at all except for adding a title to that console.log. And I'm going to take a drink of water. Reminder to, if you've gotten this far and you're seeing all this stuff in the console and you're seeing it possibly here inside of Code Sandbox's console, please remove your check-in with me, your no, your red X. Please remove that. Or your raised hand if that was something you symbolized. So if you're all caught up and you're good to go, awesome. If not, go ahead and just copy and paste this last portion. I can also save and reshare the link. That is totally true. So if you want to get caught up, that's a very good observation. You may need to refresh your browser page, Chris, if that's the case. That has happened to me multiple times in this demo already. It just happens, you know, it's part of the Code Sandbox experience right now. Cool. So yeah, if you go and refresh the little browser that's in the app, or if you open this up in another browser, so if I go and refresh this page, you're going to see my little browser here. You refresh, you're going to get new console efforts, new console logs. So maybe I just use this for now because we're not super concerned about what's on the DOM yet. We care more about what's on our state and what's being passed to props and what we have access to. Fun stuff. This is seriously, I spent the last couple years of my life in React, and I absolutely love this library. Like I didn't start off the week with you, so you guys don't quite know my passion about it yet, but let me just share with you my passion about React. It is so cool. There are so many good things about it. In fact, I'm writing up a proposal to speak at a conference about React and why it's so good for the entry-level JavaScript learner. So why it's good for new developers to learn how to use React and what it exposes you to the JavaScript language that other frameworks may not. We'll see, Michael. We shall see. I don't want you to steal my idea and submit a proposal. Okay. So yeah, that's my hope, is I want to continue to just evangelize how powerful this library is. And really, you can see its power right now just by the simple use of render and component did mount. Let's pretend that for a second data lives on a database somewhere. This data that we're consuming about cities lives somewhere in Chicago in a data center, and we're asking the World Wide Web to go across web servers, go through the network, grab that data, and send it back to us, right? That's what component did mount is used for. And to get further clarification on that, there is a link about that from Tyler McGinnis, the person who taught me React, who's like the React guru, who's been doing it for like 4 years or since it's been like brand new. He has a really cool article about component did mount, and I linked it in your training kit. Okay, let's move ahead. Let's forge ahead and let's finish this so you guys can have the last 20 minutes to play around with the mini project within your group, within your pairs, okay? All right. So, okay, cool. So now that we have data inside of our cities, list, we can actually render this data out to the screen. We can use this data, and let me just demonstrate the props, the state and props relationship again. Let's say that I had a name here, and that name was cities. Cool. And we're going to pass that name down as this.state.cities. Okay, follow along with me there. So create a name, cities, pass that name down to our props on cities list. So now if I clear the console and refresh the page, you're going to see that we have, we should have, oh shoot, this should be name. I'm sorry, name. Whoops. Clearly boneheaded today. Okay, so now we have name, and look, it's just a string called cities, empty array, and then that's not going to change. It's always going to be cities, and then after we have new state, our props are sent back down again. So we're going to consume that inside of cities list and say hello. So let's just say a list of, and then we'll just say props.name. Whoa, I keep doing that. Okay. So now a list of cities is our new title. And you see it's a little dynamic now. Name could be anything we want it to be. It could change later on if we call set state on the parent function, on the parent object, but we're just using it right here as name. So let's actually render, okay, so that's gonna be our div here. So we're gonna actually now need to get some real estate for us and have a nice little code block here. And what we want to do, I'm going to actually put this in a title tag. We'll go the old school way. It's not that old school. It's like last week that was the thing. Okay, list of cities. Now we have an H2. Now let's render out our cities by name, population, and things like that. So let's map over our props. Okay. So what do I need to type here to be able to map over our cities props? You guys navigate me while I drive. Okay. Awesome. Edward, correct. Just a quick clarification for you, William. It's fine. It's fine. Just a quick clarification for you, William. It's not a bit, I mean, I just want to let you guys know my philosophy. I do not care if you give me an answer that's not right, okay? I want you to feel like you can let your guard down here. I'm inviting you into my safe, cozy space, okay? There is no harm and no foul in actually answering a question, even if it's not correct. So don't feel bad and don't put your guard up if you get something wrong. Just keep trying. Okay, because there's a lot of other people that may have had that same type of response. But in this case, state would exist here because it's on this constructor. But in the case where we're looking at cities, we need to access it on props. You're fine, William. You're absolutely fine. So we call props because it's a property that's being passed down, and we say props.cities.map. Awesome. So every single time we iterate, we're going to actually get a new object at every single iteration. So each object is going to have a city.city. So we're going to say, cool, yeah, that is going to have a city.city. So we'll say we're going to need, and we could use the population, or no, we could use, since it'll always be unique, we'll use the state acronym. So we're just going to use, to do this, sorry, we'll get there. So each city is going to be returned as some sort of DOM element. We'll just do divs for now. And then inside of each div, we also need to return. How many of you have gotten this far and you've been like, you've forgotten to return something out of your map function? That'll drive you crazy because it's like the data is there, but it's not giving me errors. So you have to return. Okay, let's clean that up. Oh, thank you. Come again. Okay. And then inside of here, and then it'll automatically clean it up because there's prettier involved right here. I'm gonna say we're gonna do an H4 of the city.city. Because remember, this city is an object that has a bunch of properties on it that are just text, right? There we go. Starting to work out here. And we have some syntax. Okay, so syntax, let me clear this, refresh that page. Awesome. Check it out. We got our cities. I could do something fancy here that would go and capitalize the first letter of each word, but that would take, it's a little bit of effort. Maybe I show you that later on sometime this week. And then we're going to have our warning. So we're going to change the key of each of these to be equal to the city.state. Okay. And then let's say that we have a p tag that represents the city.state as the text on the screen. Seattle WA. Maybe I just change this to a p tag as well. We keep them all p tags, kind of looking ugly, but we can style this, which is stuff we're going to talk about tomorrow morning when we style our components a little more. How did we get data in again? It's a very good question. I can definitely repeat that. We're going to stay. Sorry. Oh, get out of here. Scroll over. Okay, cool. So data comes from cities.js. We set it on our state. We destructure the object and set it on our state here. So if you look, it's going to be passed down to our cities list as cities. Yeah, let's do that, Edward. So hopefully that clarifies that a little bit more. Just remember, we pulled in this data from a file that lives within our application. We set it on state. That's the parent app object. So we set it here. Okay. After we set it there, we pass it down to cities list. Cities list takes that data, shoves it into an object called props. We pull props off and iterate over the list. So if I refresh the page and we look at our console logs again, our props from city list at the time that we actually have this data available to us, we have an object called props. Well, it is referenced as props, and who has a property name called cities and a cities property, which is an array of those city objects. So that's where we got the data. It lives inside of this file right here, and we're just exporting it for use later on. Clarification on object destructuring. So props is an object. Let's destructure it. Let's actually create variables that we can use later on. Okay, so let's check this out. So I'm going to just destructure props. I'm going to delete that console log. We can safely say that we know that our data is living because it's on our screen to the right. We can see it. So I'm going to actually const out a variable called name and a variable called cities from props. This has, in the space of this code block, this local scope here, created a variable called name and a variable called cities from the data that's associated on our props object. So Edward, this would then, we would be able to do this without breaking changes, without breaking anything. Same thing here. Cities is defined right here. And if you look, I can save that, cleans it up quite a bit because then we don't have to call props dot and props dot. We can just simply call them once and reuse them over and over. Okay? Yeah. Hopefully that's some light bulbs, mind-blowing moments. I love that stuff. Okay, and then we have some sort of population here, which would be city.population. Cool. What else do we have on our objects? We have a land area, and we have built an application that consumes some raw data. And look how beautiful our application is. So some quick things before I let you wrap it up. And if you guys have any other questions, let me know. Yes, Edward, that's exactly right. It's kind of an abstraction on that. If you guys have any questions, let me know. I'll stick around for a bit. But yes, some things that we can do now is we can start styling our component to make it, lay out. We can use Flex. We can use anything that you want to use, and you can use CSS files. You can use a lot of other things that are available to you. You can use the Bootstrap library, and there's a way to get that start implemented later on. And for your, you'll see instructions on how to include that in your project when you build it. And then you'll get more exposure to that tomorrow morning when we play around with some layout techniques and things like that. You can have all of this, my friends. Jared, it's not necessarily frowned upon. It's totally normal to see that, everywhere. If you wanted to do inline styles, you could do inline styles. It just takes a little bit more work than, say, using something like Bootstrap or using a CSS file and writing your CSS in line like that. You guys also know Sass. You guys could easily, well, probably not super easily, but you guys could potentially use Sass in your React projects. That's something you could, less, I'm sorry, less, sorry about that. You could use less than Sass, you could use all of that, okay? So, but, and that's a conversation we can definitely talk about tomorrow morning. So the project today, it's more about function. The mini project is more about function over form. So making sure that you're getting familiar with the React syntax and LifeCycle. It is called, let me find it. It's called React 2 Mini. And you're going to be doing very similar concept to what I just did. In fact, you could take my code and mimic it pretty closely. You just have to change a few variables. React 2 Mini, they call it a mini sprint, but it's just a quick little guided project, okay? So now, you're going to be using this thing. Oh, you did? If you've already done that, then you can already move forward onto the full project. Thanks, Mike. So the full project is just called React 2. So you can get started in your partners with that if you're already done. Or you can add more styles and figure out how to play around with Bootstrap and things like that. Okay? So I want you to at least attempt, okay, so here's how it's going to go. You're going to work through the mini, and then after you get done with the mini and your partners, move on to the main project. Okay, the main project is called React 2. They're linked right there from Michael. Thank you, Michael. And make sure that you just follow the instructions. You're going to be installing a CLI called Create React App. And let me just show you what that does, and I'll let you go. The last little piece. Create React App is one of the coolest new technologies that has come out in recent time because there is a ton of boilerplate to get up and running with React. It's not just available in your browser, so we have to have a bunch of tools that exist under the hood. Code Sandbox does that for us marvelously. You guys did it with Webpack the other day when you did your to-do list. But with Create React App, it gives us the ability to call Create React App in the command line, and it's going to create a React app for us. My awesome app. Why? It doesn't like my naming. Cool. And it's going to go and just simply add all, it's going to build out a project that you can use from scratch. Okay? So when you get to installing Create React App and you need it for the main project and the mini, you can then reference this little clip in the video here. Or you just follow the instructions and you'll have it up and running in no time. Okay? So now if I do a yarn install, I got a CD into that. By the way, those of us who have been using NPM, continue to use it if you feel like you're not comfortable quite with it yet. If you feel like you're ready to move on, we are transitioning at Lambda School away from NPM to Yarn. So the sooner you get Yarn installed and start using Yarn, the better, okay? So now I'm going to do a Yarn start, and it's going to build my project for me. And you'll notice that if I if you look at what I got created for me in my awesome project, it built this beautiful React boilerplate application for me that has some style files. So you can look and reference this to see how to style your application if you want to use CSS. It has my app.js, which is like my main component here, and then my index.js, which is just simply pulling in app.js and rendering it to the screen. So lots of boilerplate right out of the bat. So I can't do that, Randy. To install this all from scratch, it takes a lot of time to get Webpack configured, to get your Babel installation configurations installed. It's like a bunch of things that are abstracted away from us now that we don't even have to worry about yet. Okay, and that's Dan Abramov and the Facebook team worked on this Create React App client. So that you don't have to worry about those nitty-gritty things while you're learning React, or just to get something off the ground. Yep, you have, and look what happens. Look what happens right here. I have already a boilerplate project up and running. If I go and start making edits to my code, if I go and I just remove maybe some of this and say Ryan's awesome app. Maybe I don't care about that, but I just want this header to remain. I get instant updates. All I did was save my file. And yes, to install Create React App, that's what you need. So Randy, yeah, we're actually working on some curriculum to teach you more about Webpack in the future. Webpack is just huge. It's kind of out of the scope of learning React. It's necessary to get a React application off the ground. But since somebody has already built it for us, and millions of people use Create React App every day to build projects that are of significant value, it's absolutely an amazing tool that allows you to build React apps from scratch right away. And yes, so don't get too hung up and don't get too worried about not learning Webpack now. The hope is that we have some curriculum on it for you later on. Great. Okay. Went a little bit over than I anticipated, but I hope that at least these particular pieces are clear. Render is delivering some sort of DOM element to the screen. Component will mount, or component did mount, is a LifeCycle method that we can use to fetch data and set it on state to call a re-render to our screen. So we'll let you guys go check in with your project managers /TAs. We're going to be moving away from the TA title, and figure out what you're going to do with your groups, and then make sure that you guys are working through the React 2 mini. And then once you're done with that, the React 2 main project will last you through the end of tomorrow. Okay, so you'll have all afternoon tomorrow to keep working on it. The React 2 project is probably one of my favorite that we do, because it's a really fun project. It's an Instagram clone. So if you look at what we have here for you, you're going to be building these little React components that make an Instagram post, and it's really, really, really awesome. Okay. But for now, work on the mini, because the mini is just a simple rendering of kind of what we did this morning. So, all right, I'm going to stop recording.